Hey there, welcome into Unpaid Interns. It is Friday morning, the end of the week, and our last show of February, which means it's almost March, and the college basketball season is coming to a climax. We have a great guest to talk all about it. Eamonn Brennan joins me today. He's the senior staff writer for The Athletic College Basketball. Eamon, it's great to have you on. How you doing today?
I'm good, man. Thank you for having me on.
And I mean, so many interesting storylines in college basketball this season. It's obviously been the most unique of unique years. What do you feel like is the biggest storyline as we head into March?
Oh, geez. I mean, the pandemic in so many ways, it's kind of unavoidable. Figuring out, the sort of the process of figuring out what the tournament is going to look like. Just this past week, we had sort of contingency scenarios announced by the NCAA if like a team has to drop out. The teams that are going to sort of be on standby to come in, all of those logistical details, I think that has made it obviously really weird and different. The fact that, figuring out who's going to be in the NCAA tournament has involved the process of deciding, who has the better resume between teams who maybe have played like 15 games and teams that have played 25. That's a new wrinkle. There's been all sorts of stuff, but beyond the pandemic, if the basketball season is just existing in a vacuum, I think the big thing has been, and maybe it's changing a little bit, sort of the deconstruction of the typical powers in college hoops. Kentucky having a down year, Duke having a down year, Kansas to some extent, although they're figuring things out now. Michigan State just now looking like they might get in the NCAA tournament after a season nowhere even close to being on the bubble. I think it was a few weeks ago where the 13 winningest programs in the history of college basketball, none of them were in the top 25 for the first time in like 70 years or something like that. So it has been, a really weird year in college basketball for a variety of reasons outside the court, but also just in terms of which teams are good and which teams aren't this year. Has been a bizarre year, and that would have been the case even if the fans were in the stadiums and everybody was playing the same number of games on the same calendar. I think it's just one of those years where a bunch of teams we usually expect to go to the tournament and be really good just aren't, and it's kind of created a weird sort of cultural landscape in college hoops, if that makes sense.
It's certainly been a unique season in terms of a lot of those powerhouses struggling, as you mentioned. Is some of it pandemic related that a lot of these teams like a Kentucky or Duke are younger and didn't get practice time? And I guess the other question is this something that's going to be long term? Are we going to see kind of a changing in the guard of college basketball?
Both very interesting questions. I think it's mostly coincidence with teams like Kentucky and Duke and Michigan State. Maybe the preseason stuff had something to do with it. Maybe the fact that even early season games, Duke ended up canceling a bunch of its early season games, and most of them were, the ones that were canceled so that guys could go home for the holidays were the types of games where they'd win by 30 or 40 and really get feeling good. And they're basically practices. That may be some of it, but I also think it's mostly coincidence. I also think you could throw in stuff like, Kentucky, even in a mediocre year, is going to be really, really hard to beat at Rupp Arena when Rupp Arena is full of, 25,000 screaming Kentucky fans. And that's the same at Duke. It's the same at Kansas. It's certainly the same at Michigan State. And not having that energy, seen it at Indiana, I think, a little bit this year too. I think that season would be looking a little bit different if Assembly Hall was full. And there are lots of places like that around the country. These sorts of legacy programs also have legacy fans and legacy crowds. And that's a big deal in college basketball. It's a huge part of the appeal. It's also a huge part of sort of the culture of college basketball. And I think how many wins a year does Cameron Indoor get Duke? 2, 3, maybe. So it's one of those things where with that energy not being there, these guys who many of whom are inexperienced have to find it on their own, and that's not always easy to do.
That's a great point about the fans, and not something I've necessarily been heard. It's been brought up. I do want to ask you one more question, just more pandemic related, before we get into some more specific teams. With the conference tournaments coming up, we've heard a lot about potentially teams opting out, both on the men's and women's side, to preserve their NCAA tournament. And then there's also concerns about what happens if a team has an outbreak in the NCAA tournament. What are you kind of watching pandemic related as we get to the peak of the season?
Yeah, I think conference tournament stuff is going to be interesting. I don't think that's going to happen very much, to be perfectly honest. I think there are some teams who are thinking about it and talking about it. I think there are some coaches who are sort of talking about it behind the scenes. But I think the most likely scenario is you're going to see teams that are having really bad seasons or really injury-prone seasons. Maybe a team like Miami, where they're missing like 5 or 6 guys anyway, and it's just been a slog, and they've been getting killed every other night. Maybe you see a team like that say, okay, like, we don't really need to finish this out. We have the option to opt out. We're going to do it. But, I mean, by and large, every time you talk to coaches, every time you talk to players, even those that are struggling, even those that are having difficult seasons, the thing you hear over and over again is that they want to play. They want to play games. They'd show up to play anybody, anywhere. And you really haven't heard a whole lot of, why are we doing this, particularly from players? Like, those guys just want to play basketball. And it's not to say they're not aware of the challenges or aware of the difficulties. They're probably more aware than a lot of us are, because they're out there a little bit more than some of us who are, just trying to stay in our houses and take care of our families and get our work done. As challenging as that can be, these guys are going above and beyond for their teammates and their coaches and fans and all that good stuff. So they get it. But I think I have yet to hear a single player, at least on the men's side, and that doesn't mean they don't exist, but you would think you would hear more of them. I haven't heard too many of them say, what are we doing here? Why don't we just stop? There have been teams that have done that, and particularly at the lower levels where resources are just a problem. A team like Chicago State early in the season was just like, this isn't going to work for us. And it makes sense. It's hard to keep the lights on at Chicago State, athletics department wise. So traveling around the country in a pandemic is maybe not the wisest thing to do. But at the higher levels of the sport, you really don't see a whole lot of that. So I don't think we'll see a lot of that in the conference tournaments, but we'll see. We'll see how things play out. In terms of the NCAA tournament, it looks like they're going to be pretty well covered on that front in terms of if teams have breakouts of the virus, which I think will probably be pretty unlikely because a lot of teams have had a significant number of cases already. But I think that, sort of the NCAA's contingency plans are about as good as anybody is going to do given the circumstances, which is we have teams on standby. They're going to be the teams who didn't get in the tournament, who are next up sort of on the S curve. And those teams are going to be ready and willing to jump in if need be. And they're sort of set it up so that no team is actually at a disadvantage based on, who teams are playing and where. So I think it's going to be okay. It's going to be, it would be a shame if it happened particularly to a top team, but like it's the same thing we're talking about with figuring out who's going to be in the NCAA tournament in the first place, figuring out who has the best resume. Like, none of this stuff is fair this year. The calendar is not fair. People have played a different number of games. A lot of good teams have had non-conference schedules totally wiped out to where you look at their resume now and you think, well, you didn't play anyone in the non-conference. And like, we wanted to play Villanova and Gonzaga and Baylor, and we lost all those games. That's just part of the deal this year. It's not going to be fair. I think everybody understands that. And I think even coaches who are not immune to complaining, let's put it that way, are basically universally on board with the fact that I may feel personally aggrieved, but that's just where we are this year. Everybody's got to kind of pull in the same direction.
You mentioned things being unfair and games being canceled, which kind of takes me to my next question about Gonzaga and Baylor, because they were actually going to play early in the non-conference. That game got canceled, about 10 minutes before tip-off. Now neither team has lost all season, rarely been challenged, really, either side. What does, as we approach March, an opponent need to do tactically to try to take one of these teams down? Both have just really looked unstoppable these last few months.
Yeah, and I think even now you can probably throw Michigan into that group, the way Michigan has been playing the last few months. I mean, I don't know. We haven't seen – I think what we haven't seen really, with the possible exception of Wednesday night when they were a little bit sluggish, but we really haven't seen any team do a good job against Gonzaga. It's Baylor has had its struggles here and there. Generally, they've cruised, although, coming back from shutdown the other night against Iowa State, a 2-win Iowa State team who's beaten a couple teams in the SWAC, and that's it. No offense to the SWAC, but those teams are not very good. They really looked off. So there's one hope for teams is just like hope they have to take a break or hope they have an off night. Baylor did the other night, trailed by 17 at one point, still won the game, but looked a little bit more vulnerable than we'd ever seen them before they had to pause. Gonzaga really hasn't had that at all. Even when they came back from a virus-related pause, they were really, really good. Every good team they played early in the year, Kansas, West Virginia, Iowa, Virginia, they basically blew out. West Virginia gave them a pretty good game, and I think there's something to be said for, Gonzaga has a versatile lineup with one really true big most of the time. I mean, Anton Watson plays a lot next to Drew Timme, but they also go small with Kispert as a sort of stretch four. And a team like West Virginia, particularly back then when Derek Culver was playing next to Oscar Tshiebwe and was kind of a brutal front line, got at Gonzaga a little bit, particularly on the glass, got some rebounds, played physical with them. That's not really Drew Timme's game. So they gave him a few problems. I think West Virginia has had a bit of a model there, but there just aren't many teams that can do that anyway. And even if you do that, Gonzaga probably will still beat you. So it's very difficult to figure out. And I think with Michigan, it's the same story. It's you have to hope they're not making shots. You have to figure out a way to stop their best big and Hunter Dickinson. And then, you have to get out in transition and get some open looks because all of these teams, even Gonzaga, which I don't think we maybe traditionally associate with great defense, is more on the offensive end. But Gonzaga is a top 10 defensive team this year in adjusted efficiency. They're just really, really good at everything. And I think Gonzaga, especially right now, if you look, you sort of look at their peak efficiency margin this year, they are at a level that 4 teams in the last 25 years have hit. A couple Duke teams around the turn of the millennium, those Shane Battier, Elton Brand era teams, and 2014-15 Kentucky, which went 38-1 and lost in the Final Four, and the 2012-13 Florida team, which was really, really good and then kind of faded a little bit at the end of the season. That's it. With sort of historical, statistical achievement in terms of Gonzaga. They're an elite company, and I don't think there's no good game plan for them. I think you just kind of have to hope they play bad.
They have been really dominant this season. You mentioned Michigan. I wanted to talk about them a little bit more. I mean, they've had just a great last week, a really fun game. They knocked off Ohio State and Columbus, and then really dominated in the second half Iowa and Luka Garza last night. I mean, it's only the second season for Juwan Morgan. How has he been able to have so much success early on? And I'm just looking at the recruiting classes. He's bringing in 5 stars the next couple of years. Are they the next kind of powerhouse program, consistently contending for Final Fours?
It looks that way. I mean, I think, there was a question about Juwan Howard coming in, which I thought was unfair because the dude was coaching at the NBA level for a long time. And it was sort of, will he have the X's and O's ability that John Beilein had? And John Beilein's a pretty unique coach, and his system's pretty unique. And Juwan Howard is maybe a little bit more conventional, but that doesn't mean he's not as effective. I think he's proven that pretty quickly. I think he proved that last year when Michigan really didn't miss a beat despite the coaching transition. And I think now the next step is recruiting. And to me, that's the most, honestly, maybe the most surprising part of what he's done is just immediately start making Michigan a destination for recruits. And hasn't been an easy thing to do. Again, John Beilein did some of that. They recruited pretty well. They recruited out of the state of Indiana pretty well. But the level that Juwan Howard has it going at now is really impressive. And he got guys to sign up, 5-star guys to sign up before this year, before it was clear that Hunter Dickinson was one of the best players in the country as a freshman. So that the sale, getting guys there before he even had a chance to prove how good he is, which obviously he's doing now this season, is really impressive. And it's hard to look at Michigan right now, given the way they're playing on the floor, given how they're recruiting, given sort of where the program is generally, and not think that they're going to be good for the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years, however long Juwan Howard wants to stay there. That's kind of the pace that's the trajectory he's established right now. And I don't know what would change about that anytime soon.
And you look at the Big Ten, it's obviously not just Michigan this year. I mean, they have anywhere from 8 to maybe 11 teams making the NCAA tournament. 4 teams in the top 10 right now. And this is the second year the Big Ten has been probably far and away the best conference in the land. The ACC, it felt like growing up for me, was always the best conference in college basketball. Is the Big Ten now really firmly implanted itself as the top conference in college basketball?
Yeah, I mean, these last couple of years, for sure. And I think the quality of coaching everywhere in the Big Ten now is really, really high. And I think it has been for a few years, but, you look at like a guy like Steve Pickel at Rutgers, everyone in the league pretty much has a good to above average coach, right? There are no, like, Nebraska is the worst team in the league this year by a pretty fair margin. Having seen what Fred Hoiberg did at Iowa State, I have no doubt that Nebraska will be within a year or two, most likely a year or two, at least competitive. They may not be where Iowa State was, where they were competing for the Big 12 and kind of going toe to toe with Kansas here and there. That may not be the upper end. We've yet to see Nebraska teams really do that. They have the resources as a program, I think, to do it, but it's a difficult sort of geographic area for basketball to really thrive. It's obviously a football school in many ways. But Fred Hoiberg's a good coach, and he's a good college coach, and he can get guys to Midwestern locations, and he can find transfers and build a program. So you go top to bottom. I mean, we just talked about Juwan Howard. Brad Underwood was great at Oklahoma State and probably should still be there, but wanted a raise on his contract, didn't get it. Illinois was happy to hire him. Ohio State has Chris Holtman, who's been nothing but successful since he took over at Butler originally as an interim coach, and now has turned a pretty good group of Ohio State players into one of the best teams in the country. Iowa is pretty consistently good under Fran McCaffrey, and they're sort of at a peak right now. Purdue with Matt Painter, always good. Wisconsin's Wisconsin. Maryland under Mark Turgeon won the Big Ten last year. Supposed to have an off year this year. Still going to go to the tournament. Indiana, we can talk about. Michigan State's down this year. Tom Izzo, maybe you've heard of him. I mean, it's just the whole league is a murderer's row right now, and I think it starts with it starts with the quality of the coaching, top to bottom in the league, is just really, really good. I think most of the athletic directors in the Big Ten in the past 5 years, when they've done their hires, have made really good hires, and that's where you start. The basketball talent in the Midwest, in Chicago and Indiana and lots of other big cities in the region, is really, really good. It competes sort of with almost any other place in the country. So yeah, there's a lot of talent to go around, and there are a lot of good coaches in the league. I think it's currently this year, last year, and we'll see about next year, the best conference in the country. And right now the ACC is really not even close to it in terms of pound for pound strength.
Well, you mentioned Indiana. I have to bring it up. You're an IU grad. I think I called Juwan Howard Juwan Morgan a minute ago. So clearly I still have IU on the brain. But it hasn't been a good last week for Indiana men's basketball. 2 straight, rather distressing losses for the fan base, considering how they lost those games. Where do you see the state of the program? And, a lot of fans here are calling for a change with Archie Miller. Do you think it's time for a change at the head coach position?
Yeah, that's tricky, because I totally get it. But I don't think it's going to happen. And I'm kind of the kind of person who, like, I'm an Arsenal fan, and, if Arsenal lose 4 or 5 games in a row, everyone's calling for the coach who's been in the job for a year to, a year and 2 months to get fired. And my thought is sort of, well, that's not going to happen anyway. So what's the point in like raising a big fuss about it? That's just my personality type. Other people are like, no, you gotta, screw that, blah, blah, blah. You got to get out there on it. I'm not wired that way. So part of me just thinks you can think that, but I don't think it's going to happen. His buyout is big. It's the middle of a pandemic, and nobody has any money. So the idea of actually changing coaches, paying him to go away, hiring another coach is just basically untenable right now. So it's kind of a moot point. As to whether the program is heading in the right direction is a very valid question and totally worth talking about. And I think, there's been some positive movement, but it's happening really slowly, and it happens at a rate of 1 step forward, 1 step back, maybe 1.5 steps forward. You beat Iowa twice. It's really good. And then you go 2 and 3 in your next 2 games. You need overtime to get past Northwestern, and you're not competitive against Ohio State, which, okay, Ohio State's really good. But the Michigan State loss and the Rutgers loss, especially, as you said, you can understand why those are distressing, because Indiana, for all its flaws, has been competitive in basically every game they've lost this year. And it's been more of, not enough offense besides Trace Jackson Davis, or the shot diet isn't quite right. Guys need to make more perimeter shots and not try and force it into the lane too much, or the defense just wasn't quite there tonight. But guys were competing. That second half against Rutgers was a little scary. And I mean, Archie Miller even admitted it after the game that his guys weren't locked in the way that they normally are, and that's a bad sign. It's particularly a bad sign when you've got 3 games left. You're 12-11. You're trying to get in the NCAA tournament, and you're the odds of beating Michigan and then having to go to Michigan State and go to Purdue are not looking great right now. So yeah, it's a distressing time. I do think people need to keep in mind Indiana almost certainly would have gone to the tournament last year, so they don't have that. They don't have fans in Assembly Hall, which is a difficult thing to deal with. There have been sort of circumstances where maybe the scenario Archie Miller projected when he took the job and where he thought he would have this team, or at least some of the wins he'd have at his back, haven't quite been there for reasons beyond his control. But there's no question that it is a frustrating time. And I think when you have a player as good as Trace Jackson Davis, and he has been really, really good this year, it behooves you to get the most out of that team. And I don't think anyone would argue that Indiana has gotten the most out of its talent this year, being 12-11 and on the bubble with a couple games left to play.
Certainly very rational thinking from sometimes a fan base that doesn't always think rationally. So I appreciate that, Eamon, and I hope people keep that in mind here in Bloomington. I want to transition a little bit. I know you do a lot of work looking at the bubble. You write a bubble watch column, I guess, a couple times a week for The Athletic. And I actually had a question about the quad system, I guess you can call it. Could you first explain the quad 1, quad 2, and so on, just for the people watching if they don't know what it is?
Yeah, so it's just how the NCAA organizes team sheets. So like when the NCAA is in the committee room, they have, binders full of, maybe they don't use, but probably just laptops now. They would used to have binders, but you can get printouts if you want, I suppose. No expenses spared, but it's just the sheet. The team sheet is what the NCAA uses to organize information for the committee to look at. And for the longest time, it was just organized sort of by RPI. Obviously, RPI is gone now. We have the net, which is more efficiency based. It's much, much better. The organization of the sheets is different now too. It used to just be top 50. How many top 50 wins did you have? How many top 100 wins did you have? Top 200, top 250, and losses as well would get graded along that scale. And a couple of years ago, in addition to changing from the RPI to the net, the NCAA changed how it organizes those sheets into quads, quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4. And really all that is it takes into account where you played. So if you play the 75th ranked team, I have Michigan State's team sheet pulled up in front of me because this is how I live my life. So quadrant 1 at home, a quadrant 1 win is over anybody who's ranked from 1 to 30. And on a neutral court, it's 1 to 50. And away, it's 1 to 75, which is meant to indicate like, hey, if you beat the 70th best team in the country away, that's roughly as good as beating the 30th best team in the country in your own building. It's just much harder to win on the road. The committee really likes teams that win on the road. That's a traditional sort of thing that it likes to emphasize. And so this system just puts wins in the slightly more reflective organizational buckets. And it's a little bit easier to look at and a little bit easier to make sense of than just, okay, this team was top 50 and you won on the road, or wait, did you win at home, or was that a neutral court thing? It's all kind of, this is just, it's much easier and more readable. And so, yeah, when you hear people saying things like, oh, that's a quadrant 1 win, that's what that means. And a quadrant 4 or 3 loss is very bad. Don't have those on your team sheet.
Based off that, and you just mentioned it, that there's different, it's, quad 1 and quad 2 is partially based on whether it's a home or road win. The NCAA and the committee is still factoring that in this season, even though, as we've talked about before, there's very few fans, if no fans at games, and maybe the home and road doesn't mean as much this year.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's a totally valid discussion to have, and it's one of the questions I had kind of coming into this season. But basically everything we've heard from the committee and committee chair Mitch Barnhart is that they're just going to play it as it lies this year. And that applies to everything on a team's team sheet, basically. That applies to, hey, look, your schedule isn't very good. Well, we had 7 games canceled. Okay, that's all well and good, but they're not going to try and legislate that for every single team on the bubble, every single team in the bracket when they're seeding how many games did the pandemic force you to cancel that you would have otherwise played. It's too much to get into, practically speaking. And also it's probably just better to just, everybody operates by the same set of rules, right? What's on your team sheet is what's on your team sheet. And I think that is going to be extended to home and road too. Yes, there's an argument that home court advantage isn't as big of a deal this year, although we still have seen a fair amount of home court advantage. Maybe the percentages aren't quite as high as they normally are, but it's still there. Look at poor Minnesota. They're 0-8 on the road. They can't win on the road to save their life. So we have seen a little bit of home court advantage, maybe not quite to the same extent, sort of as we discussed earlier. But I think the committee is just in a place this year where it is just, maybe there's an argument here or there for certain teams here or there, where it won't matter quite as much as it would have in a normal year. But by and large, as a general principle, they're just going to go into this as though we're in a regular year. What's on your sheet is what's on your sheet. Did you win at Michigan State or whatever the case may be? That's good. We're going to count it as a road win. We're not going to worry too much about the fact that fans weren't there because everybody still has to travel and all that good stuff. So I just think that's where they are with it, and totally valid argument. And they could have totally said, yeah, we don't really care that much about road wins this year. And I think a lot of people would have understood why. But it also, I think, makes sense to just keep things the way they are.
Certainly. I'm curious, to mention that you write the bubble watch and was looking at it. It is lengthy. It's deep. You really go in on every team, whether they're a lock, should they be in, what work they have to do. What's just the process for you of writing that and putting that together?
Oh, man. It takes a long time. It's a lot of caffeine. It's, some late hours, particularly, Thursday night with the Pac-12 games that go on until, you still have some 11 p.m. tips and stuff like that out west for the Pac-12 and Mountain West. So, the process is just going down the line, earlier in the season, particularly in a normal season. We'll start it in like early to mid-January. And at that point, it's kind of just like a big excuse to talk about every relevant team in college basketball once a week, like just a big old, chunky column about all of these basketball teams. And then as we get further and further into the process, teams get locked in. There's less reason to talk about the better teams, and we really sort of hone in on the teams that actually are on or off the bubble and who needs to do what in sort of their final games of the season. That's a broader view. The immediate process of putting it together is just me sitting in front of my computer, particularly now during the pandemic, during nap time when the kids are sleeping, or late at night, and just hammering it out based on how teams are playing, what they need to do, fun things about those teams from the gazillion games that are on in the background all the time while I'm working. It's a fun thing to put together, but we published one this morning and I am very, very tired. So that might tell you a little bit about how the process goes.
It certainly looks like a lot of work in your process right now. We got just over 2 weeks before Selection Sunday. Who's maybe a team or two that's right on the bubble right now that if they make the NCAA tournament could be really dangerous?
Ooh, good question. Honestly, Indiana, again, all their flaws aside, they have a really talented guy on the team. I think he's one of the best 6 or 7 players in college basketball. And, he's the kind of guy who can carry you in big moments in the tournament. They just need to shoot the ball around him and play a little bit better defense. None of it has to be particularly complicated. There's a lot of things that aren't getting done. And I know that's kind of who Indiana is, but I still sort of believe in their talent to a certain extent. Let's see, a team that could go. I mean, Duke is absolutely on the bubble, and it's Duke. They have a pretty good coach who has a high level of familiarity of sort of working his way through a bracket and picking teams off. And usually he's doing it from a position of strength, particularly the last few years with guys like Zion Williamson and RJ Barrett and that whole crew, year after year, really talented players. That's not this year, but he's still a wily coach, man. And in a single game scenario, having watched him coach a ton of games in the NCAA tournament, he has a certain thing where the games get close and he's been working the refs for 35 minutes and he calls a good sideline out of bounds play and Duke gets a bucket and you just feel like Duke is going to win. It's a weird thing, but they start to get a couple more calls and the shots start to fall, and it doesn't happen every year. And they've lost games. I mean, the Zion team didn't go to the Final Four, which is kind of criminal, but I've seen a lot of of Duke being good, and I think that can extend even to a year where the team is maybe not as elite talent-wise as we normally expect. But would it surprise me if Duke ended up in the Sweet 16 or something? No, not necessarily.
That's a great point. And I even think with that Zion team, I remember the round of 32 game against UCF in Taco Fall, and that was a game Duke absolutely should have lost. And somehow they came out on top. They ended up losing, I think, 2 rounds later. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was at that game. I mean, that was a great game, and you're 100% right. They should have lost that game. Central Florida played really well. Duke did not play well at all, and it wasn't even like the last minute or 2 minutes they figured it out or whatever. It was just they got kind of lucky, and it was in the end a bad sign for where that team ended up, because not getting to the Final Four with a team that good is one of the few sort of black marks on an otherwise like unmatched coaching record for Coach K.
Well, I want to ask you a couple more tournament questions as people start to get ready to fill out their brackets in a couple weeks, and was looking at the recent teams that have participated in the Final Four. The last 10 NCAA tournaments, this is kind of a crazy stat, a 4 seed or higher has made the Final Four every year in the last 10 tournaments. Who's maybe a team that's not necessarily a Cinderella like a Loyola that we've seen in past years, but kind of in that 4 to 9 range, a team that we're not really talking about that could, make a run and go all the way to the Final Four like we saw Auburn do the last time there was an NCAA tournament?
Sure. I think Creighton is a decent shout. Zagorowski, really good guard play, really good shooting, and they guard this year in a way that teams under Greg McDermott in the past haven't always. They're almost always really good offensively in Creighton, and they almost always run some of the best stuff in the country. But defensively, even when they've been good in the past, they've struggled on that end of the floor. I think a little bit more defensive solidity this year is sort of a difference maker for them. And it's the type of team that, the NCAA tournament is a couple weekends, and you play 2 games in a weekend. And if you're hot, and you win and you move on. You do it again the next weekend, boom, you're in the Final Four. And it's kind of that, it can be that simple for some teams. And Creighton is the type of team I think could get that done. I think there's a little bit of a cheat because they just fell into this sort of seed range. But Virginia struggles down the stretch here. That could put some people off on them. I still think it's a pretty good team. It maybe needs a guy like Ty Jerome, not necessarily him, but that attitude. I don't know that they quite have that this year. That sort of F this, we're going to win this game type of attitude. But talent wise and balance wise, I think they're pretty good. And then a little bit further down the bracket, honestly, you mentioned Loyola. That's the best defensive team in the country this year. And like, they haven't beaten a bunch of teams, so they're going to be like an 8 or a 9 seed probably. And that's absolutely a team that on the merits, I mean, they're top 10 in adjusted efficiency right now. They have like I said, the best adjusted efficiency defense in college basketball. And it's not just because of their league, it's adjusted for competition. So, that's a team that I think can play with just about anybody in the country, particularly on that end of the floor. And it's the kind of thing that because they went to the Final Four a couple of years ago, people will just sort of assume that sort of statistical anomaly is out of the way. But it's just a really good team again this year. And it wouldn't shock me to see them make a deep run, if not necessarily all the way to the Final Four.
Well, the other thing you have to love about the NCAA tournament is the Cinderella, that double-digit seed from the one-bid league. Who's a mid-major that you're paying attention to that could be this year's Cinderella?
Boise State could be interesting. Having seen them play against San Diego State last night, Derek Alston is like really, really good. He's like 6'9" or something. He's primarily a three-point shooter. He is averaging 17 or 18 points a game. The kind of guy who, as he did against San Diego State on Thursday night, can just hit 4 or 5 threes in a second half. No one can guard him because he's too tall. It's kind of crazy, but it's that simple. And he can kind of will that Boise team into competing above their station a little bit, based on the rest of their talent. So that's one right there that I think people need to keep an eye out for. It's not just San Diego State out in the Mountain West. I think Boise State is, they're not as good overall, but they took San Diego State to overtime at San Diego State last night, and it was almost entirely because Derek Alston really got going in the second half. And, sometimes in the NCAA tournament, you just need one guy like that. He scores 30, and you've upset your 6 seed, say Boise State's an 11 seed or something. And then you're on to the next one, and before you know it, you're in the Sweet 16, and you are the Cinderella. So they're a good pick. I would have said Drake a little while back, but them losing Roman Penn to injury is a real killer. I'll go with Boise State for right now, and then when they lose their next 3 games and don't end up in the tournament, we can forget this conversation ever happened.
Hopefully not too many people are watching then right now. Before I let you go, Eamon, I wanted to just ask you a couple more career-based questions. And I'm curious, just with this season, what's been the process for you covering college basketball and obviously the unique circumstances?
Yeah, it's been pretty challenging. I don't want to I've told people this before, but I don't like to complain and or talk too much about it publicly, because my family's healthy, we're safe, we've been okay for the past year. It's been super duper psychologically stressful having small kids and trying to work with 2 people at home and all that good stuff. Lots of people have experienced that. Other people have experienced loneliness. Everybody's challenges are different. So it's been just a challenge for everybody the past year, for sure. But beyond that, covering the sport this year has been different. I have not gone to too many games, which normally, particularly this time of year, really all season, you'd be out, once every couple weeks at the very least, covering something live, being around coaches and players, having phone conversations more frequently. Everything's kind of over Zoom now. And there's a certain convenience to being able to hop into any post-game press conference just by emailing, the press people at the particular program and getting the credentials. That's actually pretty useful, because any game happens on TV and you can quote unquote go to the press conference afterwards. Whereas, normally, if I want to go cover Virginia and get some stuff from the post game, I'd have to, drive 2.5 hours and cover the game. And maybe I'm just trying to write a feature story about one player or something like that. That's kind of useful, but by and large, it has been more difficult to cover the sport without being there as much live. And it has, we'll see how the NCAA tournament goes in terms of coverage and stuff. But, there is something lost for sure with that. And at the same time, we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's no real complaining about it. You just kind of got to do what you got to do and try and stay connected to the game as much as humanly possible, I guess, if that makes sense.
Certainly. I'm curious, you've had a very successful so far career writing for college basketball, worked at ESPN a long time now at The Athletic. What's your advice for current aspiring journalists and sports media members in college?
I never have a good answer to this question except one that was given to me when I was at Indiana by Bob Ryan. It was at a U.S. Basketball Writers Association sort of like clinic at the journalism school around the Final Four. And his advice was just, if you make sure that you love it. You really have to love it because it's hard. They're not the greatest paying jobs in the world. Your friends from college, and I can say this firsthand, will go on to, particularly at Indiana. I had a bunch of friends in the business school. Those guys went on, they make more money than I do. Right. You have to be cool with that. You have to, you have to love it enough that you're willing to do the grind. And I got really lucky with my career in that the timing was really, I'll just say it was really lucky. And I was lucky that someone at ESPN noticed me after I had been sort of blogging and writing on the internet for a period of time in my early to mid 20s. The fact that I got my job at ESPN when I did was lucky and was sort of early in the cycle. And 30 years ago, I would have been, at a smaller paper doing preps to start off with or something like that for a long time. And then you sort of work your way up the ladder. I just got lucky. So there's no real one path. There's no real one shortcut. But just if you want to do it, but make sure you love it, because it is a challenge, and the marketplace has never really been more challenging. But it's also a super, super rewarding and super fun job, and one I would recommend to everybody with the caveats that I just gave you.
Well, before I let you go, you were at IU for 4 years. What's just a favorite memory or story? Doesn't have to be journalism or sports related from your time in Bloomington.
Oh man, there's plenty of them that I will not even come close to telling you, for fear of I don't know, getting someone else in trouble. But I would say, some of my favorite memories for sure were around the IDS. That was a big part of my experience at Indiana. I walked in there my first day of freshman year and was able to start doing student newspaper stuff, and sort of was in there all 4 years. I edited the paper one semester, made a lot of friends, had a lot of great experiences, met my wife at the IDS. So that sort of in general was one of the, going on trips to cover the basketball team with two of my buddies, long 7-8 hour drives to East Lansing, stuff like that. I really missed that. It was super fun and a big part of my student experience. And then just, being basketball games, it's kind of where I really sort of reinforced my love of college basketball. I always loved college basketball growing up, but Indiana is the place where, culturally speaking, really hammered home how much I love the sport of basketball in general. And going to games with my buddies, not even covering the team, just going as a fan, early in at school there and after I covered the team, it's the kind of stuff that it's lifelong friendship stuff, and it's great memories, and enjoy it while it lasts. I'll put it that way. The 4 years goes very fast, and then you spend the rest of your life thinking about, hey, maybe we should go back to Bloomington for a football weekend or a basketball game, because that stuff is fun, man.
Great story, Eamon, and great to have you as an IDS and IU alum and doing great things out in the sports media industry. Really appreciate you coming back, at least virtually, to Bloomington and coming on today. A lot of great stuff.
Not a problem at all. I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
That will do it for today's episode of Unpaid Interns. As always, if you missed today's episode or any of our past episodes from this week or the last couple months, you can check them out on the IU Sports Media YouTube or Twitter page, or you can listen to them wherever you get your podcasts. Really excited for our next episode on Monday at 12:15 Eastern Time. We are going to have Dave Fleming join the show. He's play-by-play announcer for the San Francisco Giants and also does college basketball and college football for ESPN. So hope you can catch us then on the IU Sports Media YouTube or Twitter page, 12:15 Eastern Time on Monday. Until then, for Eamon Brennan, I'm Griffin Epstein. Have a great weekend, everyone.